Thank you. Anybody who has explored the history of railroads in the United States soon discovers that it is often difficult, it's certainly confusing, to find out the name of a given railroad at any particular time. Railroads are businesses and they suffer from the vicissitudes of any business when the economic good times and bad times come to the country. And any railroad that's been around long enough has gone through bankruptcies, receiverships, and the Monon Railroad was no exception. And businesses, when they come out of these bankruptcies, often have new names to distinguish the post-bankrupt business structure from the pre-bankrupt business structure. And sometimes those name changes are dramatic, and sometimes they're very subtle. Now, the Monon started out in 1847 as the New Albany and Salem Railroad, and that was the name of it when it got here in Lawrence County and Monroe County in 1853 and 1854. Notice that railroads were new in that time, hadn't been around all that long, and society hadn't decided whether a railroad was to be one word or two words. Well, then in 1858, coming out of that first bankruptcy, the name was changed to the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railroad. And then the bankruptcy in 1869, it became the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railway. Notice that the railroad had become a railway. And often this was done throughout the country among railroads. And often it went from one direction, from a railway, back to a railroad. Something to distinguish the company's names before and after the bankruptcies. Then in 1897, it became the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railway. And then in the early 1880s, it became informally known as the Monon, and has been known as that ever since. Then in 1956, the company board decided, a long time after they should have, to take the very common sense approach in that if the entire United States was referring to their railroad as the Monon, maybe they should just rename the railroad the Monon officially. So from 1956 on, it was the Monon. In 1971, it became part of the Louisville and Nashville, and then in 1982, the L&N became part of the Seaboard system. In both these last transfers, the Monon lost all separate identity as a railroad. And in 1986, the above became part of CSX. And then in 1994, the Bloomington to Bedford section was totally abandoned and the tracks pulled. And the sign you see there on the right is exactly the same sign as I had photographed back in 1984 on the left. Sad. Well, why was it called the Monon to begin with? An odd name. Well, when the New Albany and Salem, but from now on we're going to call it the Monon, regardless of what year we're talking about it. When the Monon first had its tracks built, it didn't have entry into Chicago or Indianapolis. That didn't come until 1881, when the Monon acquired the Chicago and Indianapolis Airline Railway. And that is the going from Indianapolis there up to Chicago, and where it crossed, you see at the circle was the town of Monon in White County. Now, the town of Monon had originally been called Bradford. And it was about that time, having nothing to do, to my knowledge, with railroading, the folks at Bradford decided to change the name of their town to Monon. There was a Monon Township in White County, and there was a Monon Creek. And supposedly, Monon was an Indian word for swift running, which lent itself to naming a railroad, naturally. I'm always suspicious of Indian names for words, but in any way, in the archives of the Monon Railroad in Salem, I found one map, and only one map that I have ever seen that is labeled the Metamonon Creek. I like the Monon Railroad better. Anyway, let's start off here with dispelling a myth that sometimes arises about the Monon Railroad and its relationship to the Indiana limestone industry. Now, the Indiana Stone District are essentially these two counties, Lawrence and Monroe, with a little bit of Owen County in there, but we're going to ignore that because it is just slightly across the border into Owen County. And it's a belt that's 10 miles wide and 30 miles long and 20 to 80 feet deep. And it comprises the Salem strata, which is the name geologists give to the building stone. There's limestone above it, limestone below it. There's limestone everywhere here in Indiana. But only the Salem strata is building stone. The stone they build buildings, that they carve statues. Well, that strata, as well the others, tilts. And it tilts from up in the east to lower in the west. And the same geological forces which upended and brought up the Appalachian Mountains also brought up the eastern part of all these strata here in Indiana. So, originally, the Salem strata would have been all over Indiana, but everything east of the district, east of these two counties, has been eroding away for millions of years until now it no longer exists. Where, as you go to the west, as that strata sinks below the surface, there becomes more and more stone on top that makes it not economical to get to quarry. So the stone district exists here because there just happens to be that area, with those dimensions that I gave, that you can economically get to the stone to quarry it. Now, if you were to have a map on the left that shows the two counties and that stone district, the areas in those two counties where the stone is quarried, and then you had to the right a map of where the Monon Railroad went, you would think that putting the Monon Railroad there in order to make use of the business of the stone industry would have been in the minds of those that laid down the route of the Monon Railroad. It's simply not true. It had nothing to do with where the Monon went. There was no stone industry in 1850. It was a business, but it was a very budding business, not something the railroads would take into mind in laying out their route. It is just very much a happenstance, serendipity, that the railroad happened to be in the district right where it would be needed most. Now, had it not been there, I assure you railroads would have come later, as they did. It would have just been a little later in the development of the stone industry. Now, whoa. There we go. We have the Monon there in 1853 in Lawrence County. And in 1855 to 1857, the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad came through, which it later became part of the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O Railroad. And a man who surveyed that B&O, or Ohio and Mississippi, was a man named Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. Now, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell had graduated from West Point in 1829, was 3 years in the Army before he resigned, taught most of the time at West Point, taught mathematics while he was in the Army, and then he went off to become a college professor, a surveyor, an astronomer. He achieved acquisition at the University of Cincinnati, where he taught the largest telescope west of the Alleghenies, which is still there if you want to visit it. He's also famous for being the man for the great railroad chase, where the men went behind Confederate lines to steal the general, and then Buster Keaton chased it with the Texas. Well, they had to clear that operation with a top commander of the time, and that was General Mitchell. He was an excellent general and would have made a better name for himself had he not died of yellow fever during the war. Anyway, he surveyed the Ohio and Mississippi coming through, and where it crossed the Monon, there were men who owned the land around that crossing who knew that was an excellent place to build a town. So they had Mitchell survey the town, and they named it after him for doing the surveying. Somewhere along the line, for reasons that will remain obscurely buried in history, probably, they added an L to the town of Mitchell in spelling it. Why they did it, I don't know. I suspect probably just for the L of it. Here we have the crossing, and you'll see here the location for the Monon station and the B&O station, and then a joint freight house. Now, in the railroad business, when a railroad crosses another railroad, the railroad doing the crossing is considered the junior railroad, and the railroad that was there at first is the senior railroad. Now, that's important because forever after, the junior railroad has to maintain the crossing. And all things being equal, the senior railroad has right-of-way. Now, this picture is interesting. We're looking east at the B&O depot around the turn of the 20th century. But notice we have a gate across the railroad. You just don't see that very often anymore, where they've got a farmer's gate across the railroad. Okay. Well, here we have you just saw two really fast pictures of the no longer there Monon depot. There's a crossing. The B&O is going east and west. We're looking south on the Monon. Now, that business about having the right-of-way doesn't always work. If somebody misses a signal, there's going to be the devil to pay. Now, we're very fortunate this evening because the gentleman on this Monon engine has graciously consented to allow us to ride in the cab as we take our journey through Lawrence County and hear a little bit about the history of the railroad as we work our way north. The first interesting thing we find is the little town of Rabbittville, sometimes spelled with an S. And you can look at those arrows, you go to your Google, and you can just barely see the spur that came off the Monon main line that headed over to Rabbittsville. Now, why on earth would a railroad go to Rabbittsville? It's because of the lime kiln that was there. And that was in that circled area where a lime kiln existed starting in 1873, thereabouts, lasting into the 1920s. And if you walk around where the kiln was, there are a few structures that tell you that there was something there before. Train cars would go in there, and something, presumably the lime, would be dumped into them through those nozzle-like things. And then you can see where limestone was quarried. Now, to get lime, you don't need Salem building stone quality limestone. Just any old limestone will do. Moving our way north, we get to the little town of Juliet, which became Yawkey in 1884. And there's a picture of the depot, such as it was, such as it is, and a picture that I can't substantiate, but was identified as the Phillips store at Yawkey, but I have no reason to doubt it. Now, while we're here, this is a good time to answer the age-old question, what is the difference between a railroad station and a railroad depot? Now, I know you've all been worried about that. Well, this is a good place to do it because Yawkey and Juliet, at one time or another, has been both. A depot is a building that allows the transfer of goods or people on or off the railroad. A station is any named point on the railroad. So when there was a depot at presumably Juliet, and then a depot at Yawkey, at the time the depot was no longer at Yawkey, it was a station. It always had been a station because it had a name, but it continued to be a station even though there was no longer a depot. So, a depot is almost always a station, but a station is not always a depot. Nor is a station always a stop or a place where you can board a train. It's just a place with a name. Okay, moving our way north, the next exciting thing is the bridge over White River. And that is especially exciting since they tried to burn it. Some arsonists set fire to it, and it gives you a tingle walking across the bridge like this. At least it does me. I do it, but I know where I am, and I'm nervous. But when the thing's burned, even though you know structurally it's quite sound, it still makes you tingle a little more. The next thing would be this lovely photograph of a bridge over Leatherwood Creek. Now, it's not like the bridge got old and they needed to shore it up with that shoring that you see under the truss structure. It's that the railroad equipment was getting heavier and heavier till it was getting more than what the perfectly functioning, safely bridge could support, so they shored it up. And of course, the next thing is up where Sand Pit is, and once again, bad day at Black Rock back in 1912. Now, the next thing we come to is just east of Green Hill Cemetery, where this map, which appears in, I think, the first volume of Jim Guthrie's book, and he got it from the map on the wall right out here just north of the stairs, that shows that Monon spur to Benzel's Quarry, right there. That's all you see of it. Well, back when I walked all 100 miles of the abandoned railroads in the county, I walked that, and that's where it goes. You see Benzel's Quarry up there to the upper right, which is just south of what used to be the Red Barrel. Is that the name of it? On 16th Street. I don't know what it's called now, but it was just south of the Red Barrel. And that railroad spur gave the Monon access to it. Now, it already had access from another railroad we'll discuss later, but that's that. Or looking at it another way on a Google image, and you see all those tree areas there that, that stand out from all the graded streets and all. Those are quarry areas, old abandoned quarry areas. Okay. Moving north from past Green Hill Cemetery, if I told you that was 18th Street crossing, you'd probably believe, if you didn't look very closely, it's not 18th Street. That is the alley between 18th Street and 17th Street. 18th Street is behind us. Now, the next thing of railroad interest is the jail, which is there on the left. And it's the time to stop to tell briefly about how back on a Saturday in 1893, John Turley of Scottsville killed Louis F. Price, the conductor on the B&O Railroad, and using the very efficient modern transportation system, it only took 2 days till Monday when John Turley was lynched by a mob from Seymour on the grounds of the Lawrence County Jail. The only man to be hanged in Lawrence County. And you can read all about that on a newspaper that covers the story that is on an easel up in the reading room, top here. So next time you're up there, read all about it. Supposedly the next Monon that came through, seeing the body of Mr. Turley hanging from the tree, tooted its whistle, and a few other trains did in the years to come, demonstrating that the railroad does not approve of murdering their conductors. Well, as everybody here knows, especially the older folks here, Bedford was a street-running town. The tracks went right down through the street. That wasn't the Monon's idea. They wanted to go up a little valley just west of town that eventually became M Street. But no, the city fathers didn't want that. They wanted it to run right downtown where the business was. And so they donated the land for a depot. And the Monon, there are no ninnies, free land is free land, so they took it, they routed it through the town, and the city fathers gave them the land to build the depot. Now, forever after, that was regretted by the city fathers, the railroad, and everybody else. But it wasn't because it was street running necessarily that the Monon didn't like where it ran. They wouldn't have liked it up M Street either, because it was extremely steep grade to get through Bedford and go north. Railroads don't like steep grades. They often had to have a pusher locomotive to push the train up the hill. And I found in the archives of the Monon at Salem a map that I have transposed the information of a 1926 proposed change to reroute the railroad to the west. There were two possibilities. You see those in the yellow and you see it in the blue. Now, they came pretty close to each other and went on up, and I don't have a slide to show you that, but they basically came in at East Olytic and would have come to where the main line is today, or was. But the radical difference would have been avoiding Bedford altogether by going west. Now, one of those routes would have required 2 tunnels, and one of them would have required 1 tunnel. Obviously, it was too expensive to do. The railroad never did it. But I have always found it as interesting that they were thinking about it as long ago as 1926. Now, here we are on the square in 1886, and there is the Sanborn Fire Insurance map with what is called the drive-through depot, where the main line didn't go through the depot, but there was a side track from the main line that would go through the depot. And an interesting thing about that slide to me is 4 cisterns and 2 wells were on this public square. Not only people, but horses have to drink, and that's the only place they got their water, from cisterns and wells. Anyway, there is that depot. It was built by Eli Dale in 1852, and it was called a run-through depot. There's an excellent article on those run-through depots that Ron Marquardt here has written. Ron's in the first row over here. Raise your hand, Ron. Raise your hand. He has written that for the Monon magazine, and a better picture is right there. That's what it looked like in 1892. Now, the Monon liked these run-through depots because they built 9 of them. Here's the one in Bloomington. And the interesting thing about that to me is not the run-through depot, but think of 5th Street, Kirkwood, in Bloomington. 2 blocks west of the square, actually 1 block and a smidgen west, there was a roundhouse and engine house at the corner of Morton and 5th Street. Now, it disappeared shortly after that Sanborn 1887 map. But anyway, then there was a run-through depot at Orleans. Here we have the tracks no longer running through, but you could tell they used to. And here's one at Gosport. Gosport lasted the longest as having tracks running through the depot. But all of those run-throughs are gone now. And the interesting thing, while we're up on the square, are these little houses. Before there were flasher lights, signals telling you to stop traffic because the train is coming. There were old retired train men, generally men who'd been injured by the accidents on the rail, working for the railroad, who are manning these, that when the train came through, they'd come out of their little guardhouses there and stop traffic. Moving our way north along J Street, we come to one of more interesting little vignettes in Monroe County or Lawrence County history, Epe's Restaurant. Now, Epe's Restaurant started out was built by a man named Basil E. Byers. No, scratch that. It was built by Fred Kibler, probably in the 19-teens. But it was bought by Basil E. Byers, who always was called Epe, in 1944. Now, on that little piece of land there was this restaurant. And the restaurant was a pie-shaped lunch counter that had about 4, 5, or 6 stools in it, no tables. If you wanted to go behind the counter, you had to go outside and come in the back. That little spot there at the bottom is where Epe's was until the dreaded day in there it is on the Sanborn map, showing you. The dreaded day in 1947, I believe, or 48. 1948. Poor old Epe hadn't owned it for 4 years when a truck going east on 13th Street was hit by this train, and the truck was pushed off the tracks into Epe's Restaurant. And since the truck was probably bigger than the restaurant and the truck both suffered a great deal. Nobody was injured except for a man who was killed who had been in the back of the truck. And with that, Epe moved diagonally across the street and opened up a real restaurant. We could actually sit down at a table. And there's what it looks like 4 years ago. Long time since it's been a restaurant.
That used to be Armstrong's car.
Okay. Well, as we continue to move through town here on our excursion, we come to a spur off to the shirt factory, or the Reliance Manufacturing Company, which of course is still there as a building. Now here, this is a little confusing. The depot on the square served as a freight depot and a passenger depot, the run-through. When they moved from there north, and they built the second passenger depot and a first standalone freight depot right across the tracks from each other. Then in 1902, they both burned and rebuilt the freight depot on the same spot and rebuilt the passenger depot on the same spot. So it's a matter of semantics whether you call that the third passenger depot. I choose to call it the second still because it is on the same spot. It was restored and they didn't move it. Then later, the third passenger depot was moved up the tracks a couple of 100 yards on the east side of the tracks, and the freight depot was enlarged. It wasn't torn down or anything, it was just enlarged. Now, has everybody got that? So here we are in 1902, and the passenger depot is burning, and the freight depot has burned across the tracks. They rebuilt both, and that is a picture about 1914 of the rebuilt passenger depot. Now, that's not where the Monon depot is today, the limestone one. That's 100 yards, a couple 100 yards south of it. Then, whoops. Here we are about 1926 with the new limestone depot with that freight depot across the tracks to the west. This is looking north. Here's what it looked like in 1984. And here's what it looked in 2015. But we're not going to remember that. We're going to remember it the way it looked back in the old days. Now moving north, let's look at on the last legs of the freight depot. This is just prior to when they tore down that freight depot. This is a 1972 photograph of the depot looking northeast at that. And here we are looking southwest. And here we are where the Milwaukee crosses the Monon. And just north of that, we're going to talk about another railroad for a little while, the Bedford and Bloomfield Railroad, which was built in 1874 as a narrow gauge and bought by the Monon in 1886. The Monon bought it because of the coal interests over around Linton and Bloomfield and all, and also because of the limestone business here closer into Bedford. And because of that limestone, they immediately put a third rail so that that narrow gauge railroad would accommodate both standard gauge and narrow gauge. So it was a three-rail railroad from Avoca to downtown Bedford. So here we see where Indiana Steel and Engineering Corporation, everybody knows where that is today. Well, just to the west of that is where the Bedford and Bloomfield, the B&B, leaves the Monon, and it curved around and started heading west along Garvey Lane. And that is where we're standing on the Monon, looking at those tracks curving around to the left to start heading west on Garvey Lane. And years ago, I was sent this picture and asked to help identify the location. And I took one look at it, and I knew exactly where it was because I knew enough about the limestone business to know there's only one place where two mills were perpendicular to each other that had those kind of roofs. However, you didn't need to know that. You could prove it otherwise. If we go to that picture that I just showed you and compared the circled part of that picture I just showed you with a close-up there, and over here, we're trying to identify where that locomotive picture is. You see those buildings are the same? That pinpoints it, if you didn't know already. Anyway, that was an aside. And that's where that locomotive was sitting when it had its picture taken. Now, after the B&B turned left, just to the left of that star, there was a round table, and here we are, where the B&B is heading west along Garvey Lane. Then it starts north and goes up through Avoca, down through Springville, and heads off to Bloomfield, points west. The Monon bought it not only for the coal interest, because that is where the Dark Hollow Quarry District was, and the Oolitic Quarry area on the other side of the tracks, and the Patton Hill area in between. That was a gold mine of limestone business at the time here locally. And the B&B was perfectly situated for it, and the Monon wanted it. And the Monon got it. Now, back where the B&B has curved, like I told you, heading out to Garvey Lane at the bottom. The B&B had a roundhouse and machine shop, engine houses here, all that stuff. And the Shea and Donnelly mill, a stone mill was there, and the Thornton mill was up there, and Stone City Products later would be built on that vacant lot, although the Stone City Products actually took over the office building of the Shea and Donnelly Stone Company, which had been built on that vacant lot. But you see what it used to look like there. And we old folks can remember the trestle over Lincoln Avenue where the B&B went out, and that's what it looks like in 2015. A lot of that changed that area when John Williams Boulevard replaced Darby Lane. We needn't point them out, but there is, some of those buildings are the same buildings along Lincoln Avenue, the west side of Lincoln Avenue. Now, I am standing on the bottom there in 2015, exactly on the railroad grade where the tracks had been. And all the pictures that the buildings that you see there are still there, except for that one on the left, this little building, just to our side of the big stone mill. Those are all stone mills, and they've all been used for modern purposes. None of them have anything to do with stone, but they have new usages. So that's Darby Lane now. And that's the old B&B Railroad. And there's the B&B heading out west, going up through Patton Hill, going up to Avoca. There's the Dark Hollow Quarry area to the left. And you see down below where the railroad crosses the 4-lane Highway 37. Now, I don't know if you folks remember, but when they first put the 4-lane on, there was a railroad crossing just north of 16th Street out there. And I'm willing to bet there was never a single train that ever crossed the 4-lane. Because very shortly after that, the railroad was abandoned. And they don't abandon railroads who are booming along with a lot of traffic. They basically abandon them after there's been no traffic for a good while. But that's where it crossed the 4-lane highway. Okay, this old map I have in there just to show where we crossed 37, which is in the red, where the railroad comes up and swerves and crosses Salt Creek. There was a covered bridge that collapsed, and you see that in the upper right. It's a reminder that not all covered bridges were highway bridges. They had railroad covered bridges too, for the same reason. Protects the timbers of the bridge from the weather. The bridge will last longer. And here we're building the new bridge over Salt Creek. Now, notice I've underlined the trestle over the railroad. Up at Patton Hill, there was a trestle that crossed the B&B to allow another railroad called the Bedford Belt, which had nothing to do with the Monon or the B&B, but it allowed it to have access to some of the quarries at Patton Hill. And here is a picture of that trestle. And here are the 3 rails that allowed narrow gauge railroad and standard gauge railroads to both travel and use this same track. And that's the bridge. And here's looking east over that trestle, the big Hoosier Joiner Mill, the Indiana Limestone Company that you see there just to the east of Patton Hill and the stoplight. Now, well, that's what that mill site looked like many years ago. And the little community between there and Avoca was called Reed Station, either Reed's with an S or Reed Station without an S. But there is where the railroad went. That building right there, you see in not hurricane times, but they had their problems with flooding as well. And we get to Avoca, and that is the depot in Avoca. Not all depots are the same. Now, we're going to, for the purposes of entertainment and education, we're going to annex a very small sliver of Greene County to illustrate again with a lovely photograph showing you the covered bridge, railroad bridge, and the tunnel at Owensburg. Now, again, not all covered bridges are highway bridges. Now, you've seen in Guthrie's books the standard photographs of the tunnel at Owensburg, and they're excellent photographs. They show up a lot. Well, here's some photographs of the tunnel you may not have seen before. This was always the weak link on the Bedford to Bloomfield, the B&B Railroad, because the tunnel kept collapsing. It was never bricked in It would have cost too much money, they thought. And finally, when it caved in the last time, they abandoned the railroad. So the tracks only survived out to the stone interests at Avoca. Now, the Bedford and Walner Railroad was built in 1905 and serviced the Walner Quarry, which we'll see here in a minute. And the Monon bought it in 1927 because they wanted it to go to a stone mill. Now, if you go out Highway 58, the railroad paralleled on the south side of Highway 58, the Heltonville Road, and if you look off to the south, you can obviously see where this railroad used to go. Then it crosses the railroad and heads to the northeast up where it crosses the Walner Quarry Road to get to the Walner Quarry up there. And you see the Reed Powers Mill down here, which is at the end of Spring Drive, which is the first road to the south past the railroad, radio station. That's where that mill was. And here we are on the Heltonville Road, and you're looking south. It's obviously a fill there where a railroad grade was. And it continues on as you watch. There's railroad grade. And it crosses 58. If you get out and you're heading east on the Walner Quarry Road, you see along the horizon the fill giving a location for the railroad to go out to this lovely little area. It's not a wet quarry hole, it's all dry. It's beautiful country in there where the Walner Quarry was. It didn't really pan out all that successful as a quarry, and the Monon didn't buy it for that. The Monon bought it because they wanted to have tracks to go to the Reed Powers Mill, which functioned as long as the limestone business was booming up until the Depression. Now, another railroad, the B&O Southwest, which was built by the B&O Railroad and eventually acquired the B&O Southwest, it left Rivervale and came up through Bedford in a way that we'll describe here. And it was built from 1890 to 1893. And in 1923, the tracks south of 16th Street were abandoned, but the tracks north of 6th Street were bought by the Monon because they wanted access to another mill. Here we have the depot at Rivervale, about 1913. This is an interesting, the B&O Southwest Railroad paralleled the river up to Palestine. And here, in walking that, I came along this photograph that appears in Jim Guthrie's book, which was published in 1958. So how long before that upper picture was taken, I don't know. But it's the same shack there in 2015 with a little motorhome addition. And now here's where the B&O Southwest crossed the White River at Palestine. And those are the abutments for that are still there. And this is an interesting slide that I created by taking what is my best guess of the outline of the town of Palestine and superimposing it on a Google image showing you where the courthouse would have been and where the obvious route of the B&O Southwest Railroad is. You can tell where that ran up through there. So you see how the county seat not moved from Palestine to Bedford. They still would have had a railroad running through town. Either way you look at it. Now, the purple is the Monon Mainline Railroad. The red is the B&O Southwest. And as it comes up from the bottom, you see a spur coming off. The Bedford Cement Plant is the first thing that is accessed. Then we go up to Benzel's Quarry. Remember that, east of the cemetery? That is the original railroad access to Benzel's Quarry, this B&O Southwest. Then we cross 16th Street, and we get up there, and there's some switching, and you get onto the Imperial Stone Company Blue Hole Quarry and Mill. You see where that label is? That's what the Monon wanted to keep the tracks to. So they obtained the area north of 6th Street so they could get to that mill. And then we'll discuss the B&O Southwest Depot up there. there's a cement plant, which is one of Bedford's most spectacular business failures. I wrote a history of that cement plant that is available upstairs. And we have there were so many foundations for their equipment and things that were still there and still there are today. It's hard to move big, huge chunks of concrete. And this trestle, that's the only photograph of that trestle I have ever seen, and there are people on the internet that argue among themselves where it's located, and they would solve that problem. And I even wrote a little informal article once where I thought I had it identified, and I only missed it by about 10 miles. But if you walk the railroad, you know where it had to have been. And that out is in the Benzel Quarry area from A to B is where that trestle was. Now that's just south of 16th Street. And up until 12 or 15 years ago, you could actually go down toward, if you went down to Foote's Tomb and look back up, you could tell where the railroad went through. And if you walk back up a little ways, you could actually see where that railroad went under 16th Street. Well, they finally made it so you can't do that, but you can tell where it used to be. Now, the B&O Southwest, they had a depot. All God's railroads got to have a depot. So it was located along I Street, just east of the Monon depot. Now, here I'm standing on what I believe to be that right track. But anyway, the depot was right there on that vacant lot between I Street there and the gas pumps. And in the far distance, above the blue and red roof over the gas pumps, is the roof of the Monon depot. Everybody with me where that is? And you can see where those tracks used to be. You can lay asphalt over tracks, but over the years, the asphalt will crack, and it'll tell you where those rails used to be. So to recapitulate here, we've got the B&O Southwest coming up, curving to the left with a trestle shown earlier, crossing 16th Street. There's where Dr. Foote's tomb is, and there's where the Imperial Stone Company Blue Hole Quarry and Mill was. And then continuing off to the left up where the B&O Southwest depot was on I Street.
So where that trestle is that was Benzel's Quarry area?
Benzel's Quarry would be all that stuff right where the site of the trestle shown earlier is. That whole area is Benzel's Quarry. Okay, now we've got to talk about the Bedford Belt, even though the Bedford Belt had nothing to do with the Monon. It was a completely independent railroad, and we'll discuss that when I give my presentation someday down the road on the Milwaukee Railroad in Lawrence County. Suffice it to say, the Bedford Belt circled all the mills out where Central Foundry is located now, and then headed north to go out. The circle that you see, the red circle, that's all the Central Foundry, at that time, all these limestone mills accessed by the Bedford Belt. Then it headed north, went west, and it too went north up through Oolitic and Patton Hill. As you're going north to Oolitic on the 4-lane 37, the railroad that you see on the east side, that you used to see the trestle, the bridge over Salt Creek that's no longer there, with me? That's the Bedford Belt. Okay, well, where it crossed the Monon, right there where that arrow shows, that's the Monon main line, and that's where the Bedford Belt crossed it. That is about 200 yards south of the Breckenridge Road. And here, there it is in 1984, and there it is in 2015. Now I'm standing 50 feet north of the Breckenridge Road on the old Monon main line looking north. And the next thing exciting that happens is the approach to the Ku Klux Cut. Now, it's not, you have to tell that bottom slide compared to the top, that's a road that goes up a very steep hill to get up to the top of the cut. And here is one of my favorite all-time Monon Railroad photographs. I would love to tell you some diabolical, gruesome story of some evil deed perpetuated by or perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan, and you will hear them. There is nothing I have ever found in the historical record whatsoever. It's my theory that probably somebody burned a cross in the neighborhood and it got that name forever after. Or maybe they were having a rally around a bonfire and wearing their sheets close to that, so Ku Klux Klan. Cut. Well, you would think that it was a simple thing for your intrepid railroad explorer to get you an exact duplicate of that camera angle, but I assure you, I risked life and limb. It has grown up so I could never really firmly tell that I was on the spot where the photographer was. I know lenses are different on cameras, so that part of it. Part of it, you can't get quite the angle you want to take because of the tree limbs and one thing. That's as close as I can get, and I'm willing to bet I'm not 20 feet off. But anyway, it was a fun thing to do. Now, going north of East Oolitic, the road Monon heads up north, and then it curves west, then it curves again, heading north, and that curve is called Horseshoe Bend. And it was a famous spot on the Monon Railroad because the photographers loved it. You remember this iconic photograph? It is all over the museum here. It's all over anybody's book. It's my presentations. You can't go anywhere without seeing this wonderful picture of 1922. And you remember me telling you that when I talked before, I mean, the photographers were briefed well ahead of time. That train was backed up into the square to get that photograph. It wasn't driven through from the south. That came down from the north, backed in, they took the picture, and then off it went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And there we are in Horseshoe Bend. I didn't even try to get that picture duplicated because it has grown up. It's a forest there. Well, the photographers were back at Dark Hollow Quarry when that train was making up. They were making it up some more. That was a big deal serving those columns. Now, I throw this in just to compare the two photographs of 1930 versus 1922. You see the difference is we've got a new Citizens Bank that we didn't have before. The Lawrence Park is removed. The fountain's removed. Still have our little watchtowers where the watchman would stop traffic. And Horseshoe Bend had its share of problems. Now, Murdoch was a junction there where there was a Y, where you see that red mark, the railroad yard. The PM&B quarry, up to the left, was one of the largest, most successful quarry areas. If you're in Oolitic and you're going north on Old 37, the PM&B quarry is essentially that part on the east side of Highway 37. The Hoosier quarry was on the left side, but PM&B, Perry, Matthews, and Buskirk. You know, in Green Hill Cemetery, the huge obelisks on the top of the hill, beautiful monument, that is that Matthews of Perry, Matthews, and Buskirk. Anyway, all major quarry areas had railroad yards where railroads would, the cars would gather with the stone in preparation to finally leaving the area on a train. So the railroad yard there heading toward the PM&B quarry, that's a picture looking west at that railroad yard, and the PM&B quarry would be on the other side of that tree line over there. And the bridge over Salt Creek, just left of the Murdoch yard where we were, that entered in over here, though, that labyrinth of spurs over in the Dark Hollow Quarry. Notice there's a lime kiln in there. We'll get to that. But that Salt Creek Bridge, the Monon was forever in the bridge moving business. I'm sure all railroads were. But as the weight of equipment on the main line kept getting larger and larger, They would move bridges from the main line over and replace them on older bridges on spurs that they too required upgrading, but not upgrading like that on the main line. So they would build a new bridge on the main line, and the old bridge would get rebuilt over on the spur, an industrial spur, like here. That's the same location. That's after the truss was removed. And this is after the stone company had taken chainsaws and cut it off so people can't get from the far bank to the bank where I'm standing on, but it didn't work. Now the lime kiln, compared to the Rabbitsville lime kiln, this was a major operation. You see it circled on the far right. Now that is a picture of the PM&B quarry. This is the famous quarry where up at the Hopkins Cemetery at the very top, the Empire State Building stone came from the quarry ledge just south of that, but it has not been quarried yet. This picture was probably taken in 1923, and it came later. But you notice here on the lower left, the circle, there's a bridge. There's two railroads that are crossing each other. Everybody see that on that photograph? Well, back in 1988, that's what that was. You could find that bridge. And there originally was a railroad running this way and a railroad up there. That's all been removed because the stone company is reclaiming that land. We won't go there. There is another picture of that lime kiln, which was a major industry as far as lime kilns go. Now, you would think that with all the spalls, grout piles around, an unlimited supply of limestone available for a lime kiln to come in and use it, you'd think there would be lime kilns all over the district. Wrong. The lime kiln business folk, remember, it doesn't take building quality limestone to produce the lime they want. And they found out very quickly, transportation costs were such, you wanted your lime kiln closer to the markets that you were going to be servicing. So they were all over the country using local limestone. But this lime kiln lasted a good long time. And that's what it looked like, that central kiln there in 1988. That's still there. Now here, this is a very busy slide, but it recapitulates what we've been saying here. The green is the Bedford Belt, and you see where it crossed the blue, the Monon, down there in the lower left. That PM&B Railroad Yard, up there at where Murdoch's is, Horseshoe Bend, and the Ku Klux Klan. That's where all that stuff is. Now, we go out to Peerless. And Peerless is illustrative of switchback railroads, which are commonplace in mountains. Around Bedford, they're somewhat less common. We don't have mountains, but we got substantial hills for a railroad to get up in places, and Peerless is one of them. Now, this railroad warning signal that I've indicated is, let's talk about the switchback. Here we've got a switchback to get up to the quarry and a switchback to get up to the mill. Now, a switchback, imagine a railroad engine and cars. We could either go forward or back, but let's say he's going to go forward. He comes off the main line going forward up here, and then he backs. And he backs up the hill to here. Then they throw the switch, and he goes forward up to here. Then he backs up to here. And he's done that to get himself up to the top of the hill. Because a railroad's not like a car. It can't go up a steep grade. It's got to go up more gentle grades. And the same thing was getting up to the fanning mill, which you always have to see whenever I talk, because I think it's the most beautiful photograph. But this is that stop sign. It was, as far as I know, unique to Monon Railroad, but it may not have been, I don't know. But very few railroads certainly had a stop sign where the green light was on all the time with a sign saying, when the light is out, stop. It's kind of a fail-safe. Here here's that fanning mill. That wins prizes in my book for a lovely photograph. Now, we got to get off the train, and we could get off at Guthrie, but I don't have any old pictures of the depot at Guthrie. So we're going to have to go for about 1.7 miles into Monroe County to the depot at Harrodsburg, where you see it there, in order to get off the train. And, whoops. And there was a depot at Harrodsburg, and you can see the bridge over Clear Creek on the other side of the water tower. Now it's all grown up because the railroad's been abandoned. So we want to show our appreciation to the engineer for letting us ride through the county. So if you'll all wave. Now, those of you who are enraptured with old photographs, there's one of my 3 volumes upstairs about abandoned railroads of Bedford, and there's a website called Bygone Places Along the Monon, where you can spend hours to your heart's content looking at photographs along the Monon that Tom Kepshire maintains. And if you want to know anything at all about the Monon Railroad, then you need to read one of these 2 books, especially the book on the right, and we have Steve Dalzell, one of the authors of that book, with us here this evening. Steve, raise your hand. Then thank you very much, folks. I enjoyed it.